gentlemen, and welcome back to Diplomatic Academy this morning. We are very privileged today to have three very distinguished speakers with us on this panel. The structure of this panel will be that I have invited each of the speakers to give a short 10-minute presentation on a topic of their choice to do with the European foreign policy and its challenges. After this, we will have a discussion amongst the panelists with a few points of input from myself, and then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience before hopefully finishing promptly at 11 o'clock for coffee and cake. Just by way of introduction, my name is John Hildred. I'm the president of the Diplomatic Academy Students Initiative, and it's a great privilege for me to be invited to host this panel today. So to begin with, I would like to invite Erhard Buzek to speak. Mr. Buzek was...
I think let's start with the others. I want to be at the end.
Ah, okay. In which case then, perhaps Professor Stadler would like to begin.
Academic.
Okay, always the academics in front. Yeah. And Professor Stadler is from the Department of Legal Philosophy, Law of Religion and Culture at the University of Vienna. And he holds a doctoral degree in law and also in philosophy. And his publications include articles on subjects such as humanitarian interventions, the soldier and society, and European security.
Thank you very much. Very good morning from my side. Also, thank you very much for the invitation to address you with some reflection from a perhaps philosophical point of view. First of all, the idea was to give you a little overview of what I'm doing in the context of foreign policy, and I tried to sum it up in a very short reflection. The first thing is we have to structure what we are doing with European foreign policy. I think this helps. It's not so good to address one topic and then foster on that day and night. You have to try to develop a structure, and as a philosopher try to develop a dialectical scheme, calling it geo-comprehensive approach, trying to put all the pictures together into the big picture, if possible. So we have three dimensions, 3 points. The first is we have three challenging dimensions. The second point is we have three challenging resources. And the third thing, we have three challenging steps to do, or measures to take. First, the three challenging dimensions. In the European foreign policy, we have three dimensions, I think. The internal one, it looks a little bit surprising, but it's also a part of the foreign policy that we know what is our interior basis. Then we have the neighborhood dimension and the global dimension. In the internal dimension, I would foster the point of we have to be clear of the common legal culture as the basis for European Union citizenship. Without that, we are not stable enough to act outside the European Union's borders. So first we have to do our homework, and this is not to try to find too many details in European history in common. The European history which we have in common is a history of wars, one to each other, so it's not too motivating. The better thing is to go back to common legal culture structures, and here surprisingly we find more common things than generally in the political sphere is expected to be found. So European citizenship could be a kind of constitutional patriotism, which is the first step to establish a European stable polis. And without a polis, without a demos, you cannot develop European democracy. So this is the first point. We have to have a stable substance which can then be active outside the European Union's borders. Neighborhood dimension, to make it very short and provocative, this is my job as philosopher, to provoke others to think, if possible against my own ideas. We have two directions of European foreign policy. In the neighborhood field, we have Germany's east and France's south. Very short and very provocative, but that's it. So Germany is the leading figure developing the eastern policy, and as long as the Germans had elections and now a not clear future in their governmental structure, the eastern policy is a little bit sleeping. What we have is the big question, what's the relationship with Russia? This is a key question for the future of the European Union. And a detail in this relationship is the question what will take place in November in the Baltics with this neighborhood meeting. Will there be an association agreement with Ukraine or not? Moldavia or not? Armenia already faded away from the club of those who want to join closer, come closer to the European Union. The French are very much interested in the south, in the Union Méditerranée, so the idea to develop the Mediterranean Sea as the old Mare Nostrum, and very old Roman approach, and therefore France has there a leading interest in this region. This can be a chance for Europe, so pooling and sharing foreign policy fields. This can also be a very big problem, which could be perhaps discussed. But I think this is a basic structure which we should never forget about. And the third thing is the multipolar world. And this means I focus on three regions: the Americas, where we have two leading powers, the US and Brazil. As you might have seen, some meters away there is a conference on Brazil, the emerging superpower. So Brazil and the United States on the American continent. The one more fading out, the other one emerging. The same thing in Asia with the two giants, China and India. China already a little bit fading back from their energy, and India more and more growing up, which is also not really realized. Also in the Near East region, to address the third one, we have Turkey and Iran. Turkey already a little bit fading out from their influences, and Iran with the new president now starting a new game. And I think this is closely to be observed by Europeans, because Iran is for us a very interesting country. Perhaps partner, perhaps country, perhaps challenge, but very interesting. These are the dimensions I would address geographically. Then challenging resources. We have a human resource dimension, the natural resource dimension, and the economic resources dimension. The human resource dimension has 3 points. Demography is a challenging question for the European foreign policy. If you're not addressing that, forget about European foreign policy. Then in context is that migration. I would not agree with the Austrian security agenda calling migration a key threat to Austrian security. I would call it a global challenge for European foreign policy, but not as a threat. I would call it a challenge. And the culture in combination with that. We have to understand who we are, we have to understand who the others are, we have to understand who we can help them not to be forced to migrate. So we have to know a lot more about people outside Europe than so far. Natural resources, 3 points. The energy factor, you know gas, you know the oil problematic within the Near East, with the Russian relations. This is one big point. The climate dimension has to be taken into account. And as a part of that, but in the military circles already heavily discussed, the water dimension. So the water wars. So we cannot forget about the fact that the people first to have to survive and then to have to develop a nice life. And if without water, everything stops. Third point, economic resources. Here we have the 3 points. Euro stability, of course, for European foreign policy. The euro is the only point, and this is a word game which works only, I think, in German. In English it doesn't really work. I will try it in German too. Where you can touch Europe. In German it's better. The euro is the only thing where you can Europe angreifen. Means two things in German. Angreifen means touch and attack. So you can Europe only attack on the euro because it's the only thing which exists from the European Union. What else will you attack? There is nothing to be attacked. So we showed our nose out of the water like a submarine with the euro, and the first thing they saw from us was attack. And this is the euro. See it from that point of view also, if you want to understand European foreign policy, and then you understand we have now waged a war the last 5 years. Then social costs explosion is for Europe a very key point. We are more or less militarily and politically, so to say, frozen, because 1/3 up to 1/2 of our resources is only going into social costs. So we have no oxygen to act. Others who are our competitors don't have these costs, and this is the only reason why they are still seem to be active. And the third thing is competitiveness, This is especially in comparison with the United States and these trade agreements which they are wanting to expand. Last point, very short, 3 challenging steps. How could Europe try to coin or develop or to shape their foreign policy activities? 3 steps. First we have to do, and it's a little provocation, values building, society building, and the 3rd step is state building, not the other way around. First you have to do values building, that means education. The first thing you have to do is to export education. This makes people free. And then they understand their humanity. The second point is then you have to do society building. This is a very smart and intelligent development policy. Help people to help themselves. And the 3rd step, the last step, to my mind, and to the mind of Aristotle and other philosophers, is the state itself, the institutions. Don't start with institutions in a country where the society is broken and education doesn't exist. Because due to Aristotle, who developed, for example, the idea of democracy, democracy is based on education and a certain level of economic development. Without that, it will never work. This said the inventor of the program. So these are some provocations from my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Guillaume Xavier Bender. He is from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and he is a program officer based in Brussels. And he monitors EU policies and politics in relation to the program that he works for, and is also interested in the EU economic affairs, international trade negotiations, and global and national security as well. So please, Mr. Xavier Bender.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Indeed, quite a barbaric name, the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'll explain in a bit. First, I want to thank the Paneuropean movement and the Slovenian Paneuropean movement for their invitation and the Diplomatic Academy for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in Vienna. I used to live on Mühlgasse, right nearby, so always great to be here. And a great city to talk about foreign policy and EU foreign policy. It all almost started in 1815, starting to talk about European foreign policy, and it started here. The German Marshall Fund of the United States, we are, for those of you who don't know, the offspring of the Marshall Plan, created in the 1970s as a gift from the German governments to the United States to create an institution that would continue to strengthen transatlantic relations, and that's what we try to continue doing today. And part of that is looking at how Europeans and Americans can cooperate in global affairs and in foreign policy and economic policy and other policies. And I, in Brussels, I'm working indeed on more the economic policy part, but the nexus between foreign policy and economic policy. It's an interesting question that we were asked to discuss. It was mentioned yesterday, what is European foreign policy? And I'll be less philosophical than you were, Doctor. My remarks will go to 3 points and then a conclusion and stay in the 10 minutes that John wants us to do. What is foreign policy and what is EU foreign policy? It's hard to define because the EU has been more into reaction than action when it comes to international affairs in the past years. It's done a remarkable job on crisis management, on development issues. It's increasingly difficult to see what the EU can do and what it wants to do in terms of international relations per se. Does the EU have a goal in foreign policy? What is a strategy? What is the EU as an institution trying to achieve? Or is EU foreign policy the aggregate of 28 foreign policies? It looks a lot like this. It's 28 foreign policies that are summed up in a statement. And the job of the High Representative is extremely difficult in that sense, in trying to define a path, a strategy, and a reason for EU foreign policy to exist. To give you a little bit of data, it's Saturday morning, I'm sorry, but just a couple of numbers, because that's what we also try to do at the German Marshall Fund. We survey Europeans and Americans on global affairs, and in our most recent report, it's a question we've been asking for 12 years. but we ask Europeans and Americans if, under certain circumstances, war is necessary to obtain justice. In the United States, 68% of respondents say yes. In Europe, 31%. It's a huge gap. When we ask Americans and Europeans if economic power is more important than military power in world affairs, we have 64% of Americans that say yes, 83% of Europeans that say yes. There are differences in how Americans, Europeans, and even within the EU itself see what foreign policy is, see what an instrument of foreign policy can be, whether it's a foreign service, whether it's a military action, whether it's development, whether it's crisis management, whether it's, again, economic policy per se. I'm mentioning these numbers because, again, you need a role, you need a goal, and you need a role, and you need to define the role that actually fits your goal. And in military terms, you think of capacities, goal, and tactics. And that's even closer to what you can try to do in foreign policy as well. What can the EU do then? And that's my second point. Is the EU a leader in foreign policy? I'm not sure. It's a facilitator, and it might actually be where the EU itself can be the most have the most positive role, which is facilitating relationships either between its member states and other countries, or in global affairs. You mentioned the case of Iran. It is probably the greatest example of how the EU as an institution can facilitate a dialogue and a conversation in a highly sensitive and sensible topic. There are other issues as well, but it's not in a position to actually propose something that will lead to a united and common foreign policy. We talk about the common defense and security policy. It is still at the level of a nutshell. It's still questions of pooling and sharing resources. The EU is very dynamic in trying to figure out what to do with this, but it is left at the level of the member states. And that's probably, and I'm coming to the third point, EU foreign policy cannot go beyond the role of a facilitator as long as the EU does not have a competence and a full competence in terms of foreign policy. The only area, and that's maybe I'm maybe a little bit too subjective with this, but one of the only areas where the EU in foreign policy is very can do something is trade policy, because it is the competence of the EU, and increasingly in Brussels you hear rumors or corridor talks that the real foreign policy is being done at Director General for Trade and not at the External Action Service. It's not called the DG Foreign Affairs. It's called the External Action Service. It's a different way of perceiving what you can do and how you can do it in terms of foreign relations. Trade policy increasingly being a foreign policy instrument and a foreign policy goal. You mentioned also, Doctor, the negotiations between Americans and European for a trade agreement that actually were canceled yesterday, during the night, next round. The rumor has it that Europeans were willing to pay the flight tickets for the Americans, and that was what that's what's being said. It's come to this point, unfortunately. That agreement in Brussels, and that allows me to go back to the citizens, is not being seen and perceived as a technical agreement, which it is. It is a technical agreement. It's a negotiation on standards, regulations, highly technical. But in Brussels, it is seen as an opportunity to define the relationship between Europeans and Americans, and the relationship between Americans, Europeans, and the rest of the world. And this is why it's highly politicized, and this is why you are starting to see again movements in the European Parliament, in member states, groups of citizens that are actually openly voicing their opposition to this agreement, not based on technical clauses or discussions, but on principle. The principle of an agreement with the United States. And that's maybe where citizens may play a greater role in foreign policy in the EU, which is to voice their concerns. And concerns in both definitions of the word concern. You're concerned because you're worried, and you're concerned because you have an interest. And in terms of foreign policy, it's difficult for citizens to feel concerned about foreign policy unless they're very much affected by it directly. And that is something that may be a way for Europeans to be more active and participate in foreign policy and EU foreign policy if they may. I'm not a big fan of petitions of the European Citizen Initiative. I think 1 million voices for a Commission proposal is something that in the end does not lead to something concrete in terms of a democratic process. I think the we the people, the American we the people, is closer maybe to something that could work. Again, it led to the White House having to answer if Texas can secede, or if the Death Star actually can be built. So it's not. I'm not sure if petitions. It was mentioned yesterday that this initiative could be a good thing. There should politicians, European politicians and leaders, are the people that Europeans should go to discuss these issues, and should ask them to actually lead the EU to be a major player. But I'm not sure that we have the leaders today to actually do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and our final speaker today is Mr. Erhard Busek, former Vice Chancellor of Austria from 1991 to 1995, and he played a very key role in Austria's joining of the European Union. Also, as the representative for the EU enlargement of the Austrian government between 2000 and 2002, he also had the opportunity to negotiate with all of the countries who joined the European Union in 2004, and so I'm very proud to be able to sit beside him as he explains, hopefully, more about the European foreign policy. Mr. President.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's quite a challenge to speak about, because first of all, I may say the title of our meeting here is EU Foreign Policy. I think may I say it's not existing. So far, my contribution is finished. I think it is a characteristic situation of the European Union being in between. There's an old joke in the Habsburg monarchy. An archduke is commanding a maneuver, and then he was asking, I think he was of the family, but he was not really a military expert, and then he was asking the generals, how did I do the job? And one general answered him, I think, Your Royal Highness, or Your Imperial Highness, I think you have chosen between two possibilities, the third. I think this is a characteristics for the competence on EU foreign policy. I think what the European Union is doing, by the background that it is neither a state nor only a collection of some states together cooperating on some subjects, it is in between. I think you can see it quite clearly on foreign policy. I think it's not yet decided. Do we want a foreign policy, yes or no? So far we have a commissioner on foreign policy, Baroness Ashton. She is vice president of the commission, I think giving there an outstanding job on this, and so on and so on, and she is chairing the meeting of the foreign minister and so on. But the competences and the capacity is nearly to zero. And then in the European public, everybody is criticizing the poor Baroness Ashton. But she can only do some things and making some statements. She's very reluctant to make statements. That is not blamed by some member states, knowing everything better and so on and so on. And I think that's a real situation. And as long as the member states are not really able to decide, do we want the capacity of a common European Union, maybe on foreign politics and also on other subjects? I think energy was mentioned. The poor Mr. Oettinger is responsible for nothing. He can give some nice sentences to the member states. It's idiotic to have no competence of the European Union on energy, because it's one of the key questions that can be only solved cross-border, really in cooperation. So far it's very easy to play by Mr. Putin with every one of the member states and not with the European Union. That's a real situation. I'm outspoken on this because I think we have to do it in favor of the European Union. I'm a fan of more competences. And here the European Union is partly in the own history of the member states. I give you one outstanding example. I'm a fan of this marvelous discussion about the Security Council of the United Nations. Because here two member states, France and the United Kingdom, have the veto possibility of the five. Then my beloved Germans are coming up and saying, we want to be also one of the members with the veto possibility. I think here, I'm criticizing here the Germans, they are sometimes more European than others, but here they would have said, no veto power for France, no veto power for Great Britain, for the European Union one. That would be the right way. I think this discussion is not existing. I think sometimes it's mentioned from the science side and from journalists and so on and so on. Politically, no. I think here I may say all the member states concerning EU foreign policy are behind the reality. I think you hear the reality by the two speakers before, what is really necessary, but I think it's not really existing. I think we have to ask all the governments and the parliaments of the different member states to make a reality check. I want to say quite bluntly for Austria, EU foreign policy for the Austrians being in charge of this is not really existing. It is neither existing for the Austrian parliament, nobody is asking here any question about foreign policy. They're asking no question on foreign policy in general. I think, yeah, I may say, I think zero. And I think that's an extreme danger. So far, I'm very much a fan of this. That's the first statement, beg your pardon that it is negative, but the sense of my negative statement is that we are getting positive actions, which I think is extremely necessary day by day because things are moving forward, because we are living in a global village. And here we have positioned Europe in this context, which for sure has really to happen, I think, really every day. The second part of my comment might start with my experience through my political life, because I think by experience you are getting a reality check and you are getting the feeling what's necessary. As was mentioned, I was in the government at the time where Austria entered the European Union, and I think in this time there was an event being extremely important for Austria, the downfall of Yugoslavia. Here, being in the government, I may tell you the European Union was not existing in this. Existing were the United States. Thanks to Mr. Clinton, I think it was possible to end the horrible 4 wars in the Balkans and to come to a solution. I think nobody discussed that the agreement which ended it, Dayton Agreement, was done in the United States. But all Europeans were always saying the Balkans are a European affair, but without any activity. I have a certain admiration for the German government at this time, because Joschka Fischer pushed through the participation of the Germans on the military actions, which by the history of the Germans on wars in the Balkans is admirable. That has been also said, they were overcoming their own history in this context, and I think that has to be really accepted. So I'm starting with my experience. I was asked after the Dayton Agreement by another Secretary of State of the US government, I think, to overtake an initiative. Southeast European Cooperative Initiative. I'm still the coordinator, it's still existing. We are sitting in a small room at the OSCE, forget it immediately. But it was a nice instrument, I think, to do some things. We are doing it in the European Union strategy on the Danube region. We are doing some things, but just for your information, that it makes sense to continue this in a certain way. What was the problem? I was appointed there. It has a really nice background. This other Secretary of State was a born Viennese Jew. He knew me out of years before. And he got a certain smell that I was doing something for dissidents on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I must have some knowledge. And he was calling me, hey, dear friend, I think you shall overtake this, and so on and so on. Okay, you have to go to Brussels to convince him to support this initiative. I went to Brussels, and the command of Brussels, I think, was at this time a very clear one. what are the Americans doing here in the Balkans? It is a European case. My question, on the contrary, was what are the Europeans doing? We will have a conference on the subject. That's all true, for sure. And there was no action. So we did a lot of things. This cross-border crime fighting center in Bucharest still existing was an American initiative. And I had a lot of troubles to get Europol. No. Europol, I think we have too many problems internally. I think we want to be connected with this. So was I. So I was collecting the member states who had an interest to fight criminality in this context, and they were based in Bucharest. Positive result, I may say. Here, the understanding of the member states were quite stronger. I think, please remember, there was a certain move, especially by my French and British friends, we shall keep Yugoslavia. Even there were some theoretical discussions, let's offer them membership to the European Union. But in practice, and I was in contact with the different powers in Yugoslavia at this time, nobody showed up on behalf of the European Union. Not existing. Again, only the Americans were in reality acting. Okay, then, positive, not the European Commission. It was a German presidency in the European Union. Again, I want to mention Joschka Fischer, creating the Stability Pact for Southeast Europe, including the Americans. I think it was an instrument working at this time. Nobody's perfect, also this is the initiative, but we moved some things forward. So far, I think here was a kind of foreign policy. I think my partner on this, and he was excellent, was Chris Penn. I think here the background of an old imperial power like the United Kingdom was extremely helpful because he had a certain feeling. Maybe for his feeling, Hong Kong was more difficult than the Balkans by his experience and so on and so on. But he had a strategy. In all my deep friendship to Olli Rehn, he was a successor, he had no strategy. But nobody was asking for a strategy in this context. Some European parliamentarians, we see, were showing up, but it was quite interesting. It was a job of those parliamentarians coming out of the neighborhood. Germans, Austrians here, they had a certain feeling. For the others, I think it was quite far off, and so on and so on. Foreign policy, EU foreign policy, for sure, existing or not existing. I think I finished the Stability Pact. We created the Regional Cooperation Council. Here, out of the states in the Balkans or in Southeast Europe, or wherever I want to say, that's a special case. I think I'm admiring always the Commission for inventing words. West Balkans is the most idiotic expression I ever heard. Because neither in geography nor in history you have West Balkans. I think I understand they don't want to say the former states out of Yugoslavia minus Slovenia plus Albania. It would be the other form. I think even it's of importance also in foreign politics which language you are using. And I think that's not really developed, and to be really critical, it's also not developed by the European Parliament. It's not developed by the European public, if a European public is really existing. I have my doubts. I think I'm always making the nasty joke. We have talk shows every evening. If you're switching through all your channels, public channels and so on, talk shows. There's no European talk show, but the simultaneous translation is already invented. I think I was going to the European Broadcasting Union asking, why do we not have a European talk show? I got a nice answer. They said to me, we have to divide the advertisement fees, and that nobody wants to do it. Straight, really straight. So far, I'm always making the dirty joke. We have one European talk show. This is the Eurosong contest. Because at the end of the Eurosong contest, we are voting about each other, and you can read out of this, not the quality of the songs. You can read out of this feeling for neighborhood, or being on distance, and so on and so on. I think that's really interesting what's existing here. Let's skip the songs, let's make the votings. I think we can learn a lot out of this. I think this is mirroring the situation here on the subject of great importance. I think I want to continue on this. We need a strategy, foreign politics concerning what the Chinese are doing in Africa. For the moment, not existing. I think we have this competition. I think the French are looking to the Mediterranean, but may I say without results. I think this Mediterranean Union happened beside the Arab Spring. But the Arab Spring had a deeper impact also on the foreign politics of the European Union by reaction as all what was done here. But I think this supervising and criticizing and getting another strategy is not really done. I think here you have an extreme gap between the reality and the European public in the political discussion. I think that's not happening. So far we have some strange actions, and Austria is now the ambassador to the United Nations. I think it is a very nice job, he has a very nice building, and he has nothing to do. Besides the fact that he is making receptions, and there are some meetings here in this house, and so on, because he has no capacity.
European ball.
Yeah.
Viennese ball, European ball. Which has to be organized.
He is totally right. That's it. I think the Austrians are always going there to cite the effects that it is looking like that we are doing something. And so far he's doing the ball. Huh? That's the one thing which we can here contribute. That's an extreme problem. My next connection, and it was mentioned, there was a charge of enlargement. Huh? May I say we have in the moment no strategy on enlargement, which is a part of foreign politics. Moving some European states towards membership and out of foreign politics to inner affairs. To give you an example, I cannot understand why the beloved member states are not able to push our beloved Greek friends to change their attitude to the name of Macedonia. You cannot explain it. I think nobody is really discussing it. We have still this idiotic development. The Macedonians are also contributing idiotic by the statue of the hero in the place of what they are doing in this context. There's not even a discussion on this subject, but it is of extreme importance because I think getting in West Balkans, Southeast Europe is of great importance concerning stability of Europe towards the Arab Spring and the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. We are missing the opportunities. The next is, and a former foreign minister of Austria, being commissioner on foreign affairs, was involved in this. I think the Eastern neighborhood strategy, I think, is not a success story. It has to be said quite bluntly. It's not quite clear. Ukraine, yes. Ukraine, no. The Russians might feel offended if we are doing something in this context. I'm coming from Lemberg areas, Lvov, whatever you want to say to the city by the name. I think it is really Europe. And for sure, I think we have to do something to support them in the right direction. But everybody is hesitating and so on and so on. We need a clear strategy towards Putin's Russia, and we need a clear strategy concerning Russia in general. I think it's not only Putin's Russia, there are also some other things that are extremely important. I have some expectations concerning Vilnius. I think to be on the positive side may be that the place is supporting some positive developments because they have specific experiences in Vilnius on this subject. It's extremely necessary, I think, to do it. I share the opinion which was done here that the business community is pushing forward. I think it's the only force creating a kind of EU foreign policy by supporting the investment, but not in general. I think that's also one of the things where we are reluctant concerning energy. I've already mentioned what I'm missing here, because it's not only an economic question, it's an extremely political question what we are doing here on energy, and here we are missing all the opportunities. I think these nasty jokes about all the pipelines. We were playing Nabucco for a longer time. We are looking for the next opera title for a pipeline and so on and so on. But this is no consequence out of this. I think here we need a condensed strategy, which for sure, here I'm defending, don't make the Commission only responsible for this. It's really up to the member states. Here we are also in between. I think we have no foreign minister in Austria. It is rightly named the Ministry for European and International Affairs. That's what the real subject is, but we have no foreign policy. It's not really existing, by the way. I think sometimes a little bit of hot air, but we are not even able to manage the situation in our neighboring country, Hungary, to have the right approach to the problems here existing. So far, I also want to mention a chapter where we Austrians should be more than quiet, but the question of security is of extreme importance. And I think here we need an EU foreign policy concerning the fact that I'm quite sure that the power of the United States is going down on this. Who will be instead? I think where is the discussion of this subject? I think the investment in security is going down. We have always this nasty discussion about the Americans and the NSA and so on and so on, but that's not for sure enough. And it has to be opened in this direction that we are clearer what might go on. Summary, we need an EU foreign policy. We're far off of this, but we are also far off from a real discussion on the different levels, which means the European Parliament. I'm a fan of the European Parliament, but foreign politics, they are not so strongest, which is a pity. We need it by the civil society, NGOs and so on and so on. I think some think tanks doing something on this is not enough. It is interesting, it was Soros, again sometimes it's always Soros, creating the European Council for Foreign Relations. I'm on the board of this. I think it's quite interesting, moving step by step forward. May I say, it's extremely difficult to get politicians on board to discuss here at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I think only Madame Bonino was able to come because she was a member of the council. That's for sure. Joschka Fischer is chairing it, but I think we are, including myself, here a collection of have-beens. And I think that's not enough. We need those who are actually acting on this subject. But maybe we are able to make a proposal how we can move forward. Beg your pardon for being very critical. I'm asking you to see it as a positive contribution, because I'm urging that more than it is really done has to happen in favor of Europe, because it is a real question of the positioning of Europe. I think we are living out different parts out of history. I'm warning you, we will have the anniversary of 1914 in Sarajevo, and all the beloved member states will explain which outstanding role they played in forming the world and later on after the First World War. I think they shall discuss how we are forming the world now actually, and not always looking back. I think we can have an impressive history, but that's not for sure enough. Austria is an example for, we have an impressive history, but out of this is left Emperor Franz Josef, Sisi, and the Mozart-Kugeln, and nothing else. And it is really asked what can be contributed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Just to start the discussion amongst the panel members, yesterday we heard a lot of talk about the need to get back to an European identity, and for us to find this internal unity, this internal identity before we're able to go out and to project this identity in an external way through our foreign policy. So I was hoping that each of the panel members would be able to comment on that. What is the European identity? What are these values that we're supposed to be encompassing and therefore then also projecting? And as Mr. Bulzek said, is this just that the Eurovision Song Contest is the only way in which people know about Europe and other countries as well? And how can this then be integrated in the next generation of European citizens? Perhaps Professor Stadler, would you like to?
Thank you very much. First of all, a little also hopefully cynical remark. I got more and more now the impression that the European Union's the biggest problem lies in the fact that they look and act more and more like Austria. This is the biggest threat. Even going back to the question, what do the Europeans have in common? Eurovision Song Contest and what the Austrians would
It's
have
the
started.
Austrification.
The Austrification of Europe, this is the biggest threat.
You
of
are
it.
right.
This is but we have also been, not forget our founder, the pre-thinker of the whole project. So don't forget about that. So it has a historical sort of impact on that. Coming back to the concrete question, European identity. Well, do you know what I want to say also to shock you a little bit? One of the founding fathers of the European integration process, besides all the famous people we know, was Stalin. And this is also a matter of fact. The outside threat forced the Europeans after World War II into a survival community. Therefore, they defined their identity outside, what we are not. We don't want to become Soviet. So we oversee and overlook and forget about the details of the last 200 years of history, what the people have in mind, just in order to survive, because the threat was overwhelming. So this was one point. The second point, which we should not forget, we have a mental problem. Before we can develop an identity in Europe, we have to understand one little detail. And this is why we are a leading nation here in Austria for Europe, because we have been the first suffering this experience. Austrians and now Europeans, you are not longer the center of world politics. You are not longer the subject of world history. You are now the object of world history. The Austrians learned in 1918, others learned in 1945, and perhaps the British are now starting to learn it also. So the word of Britain is broken doesn't sound like we are still organizing our post-imperial future. There's a new approach also there. So perhaps this is the point. So the Europeans are not longer the subject of history, we are the object of history. Others are deciding what's going on in Europe and not we ourselves. Or to make it in a little word game, which now also works in English, peace in Europe does not necessarily mean peace for Europe in the 21st century. This had been true for the last 500 years. Is there peace between Prussia, France, Britain, Austria and Russia? That means we have peace on earth. And now it's different. Others are deciding on peace and war. So we are the object, not the subject any longer. So I would come from the pessimistic approach. We should reconsider the threats. Therefore, I address the challenges to say, don't try to establish an identity from what we had in the past. Try to establish what we have to master together. So a proactive future is identity, what we have in common to master, and not what we have in common in history, because this is a way which doesn't lead anywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite a question, the European identity. I'm not going to go into the values that make Europeans what they are. I think everyone knows them. And Europe is this ideal of a space for peace, prosperity, and stability. And that's what the EU is still trying to do, and that's what member states are still trying to do for their people. But if you think about it in broader terms, there is that comparison that's still being made between Mars and Venus, between Americans and Europeans, and we're still Venuses. And increasingly Americans are trying to be Venus. It was said, and you said it, Mr. Buzek, the question of who will, in the end, in the years to come, be the main actor in global security is to be defined. And even the United States is trying to actually pull back from that image of being the Mars and trying to be more Venus. Jupiter, right. So that is maybe something to look for in the future. For me, Europe is also, and I think it's something we often forget, it's a space with an external border. There's just one external border, and that's the EU. The EU's border. It has a lot of implications within Europe. In the Schengen area is, I believe, one of the greatest achievements that Europeans, not only the EU, but Europeans have done. The euro is a great achievement. You have a number of other policies within Europe that are great achievements, but the biggest is the fact that we only have one border. I'm not going to get into the debate whether that border actually needs to be broadened and where does it stop. But that's probably one of the reasons for the identity of Europeans and one criteria. We are from one space and we are recognized as being from one space. But still, it's a question we were discussing yesterday with a few participants here. I think we're one of the only regions in the world where we say where we're from. We answer by country and not by region. When you're from Dallas, you're American, and you answer I'm from America. You don't answer I'm European. You answer I'm Austrian. You answer I'm French. I'm British. And that's probably the next step, is to making people be proud of being part of that regional space that is Europe. And it's not. I don't see it as short term. It's going to take a lot of time. It's only been 60 years or 70 years. So that's probably one point to answer the identity question.
I think I want to continue with your last remark, that we are not saying we are European. That's not true. I remember I'm in ongoing confrontation with my beloved friend Václav Klaus, being anti-European. I know him since 1968 because in this time he was at the European Forum Altach, and we had to decide does he go back to Prague, where the Warsaw Pact troops were, or is he leaving? And him, I was putting the question, when do you feel that you are a European? He gave me a positive answer, if you are outside Europe. I think that should be taken serious. That's a positive situation, because we are not anymore gaining our identity. I think for a small country like Austria it's absolutely very difficult. We are always mixed up with Australia. I was always making some comment, Austria, no kangaroos, no kangaroos. That you are not getting difficulties. So far, it's on the move. It's on the move. I think that has to be mentioned by self-definition. I'm really convinced, what was in the context of the discussion about constitution, that Europe is a result out of Greek philosophy, Roman legislation and law thinking, Judeo-Christian religion, Enlightenment and modernity. I think that's quite a discussion. We have to ask the different partners on this scale, are they really contributing to this identity? Philosophers are doing sometimes. It's quite interesting that more and more philosophers are looking to Europe here. I think Habermas, for example. So that's a very interesting development. I'm a little bit more critical on the Christian churches because they are self-employed themselves and they are not looking to Christian responsibility. Lampedusa is a responsibility for Christians, I'm saying. Just to give an actual example, the Pope did something right visiting this, but that's not enough.
It's European.
The Europeans are doing nothing.
He is not European, so he
He's
did
not
something
European. You are right. That's right. Maybe I think Pope, Rome, Europe. You're right. Yeah. I think so far it has to be more done in this direction. I think the identity is in a certain way developing. We should not discuss so much how it is. We should more discuss what are the European responsibilities towards the rest of the world. For what are we standing? The rest is a wrong expression because it's not the rest. It's a bigger part. We are only 7% of the population, for example. I think we have to create an awareness how big we are or how small we are in reality. And that discussion we need in the public, here, in the broader public, what are our contributions to the global village, to the world here in reality. And here we can contribute, and this is, I think, part of our identity. Personally, I may say I'm extremely positive on the contribution by culture of the identity. It is very interesting that there is no competence of the European Union on culture. I think this nice Cypriotic lady is responsible for nothing. Look to the budget figures, I think zero here. But there is a concern of European culture. I think that's not anymore connected with the nation here. I have to do a lot. I think I'm in charge of the Gustav Mahler Youth Orchestra. I think we have 30 youngsters out of 30 nations out of Europe here. Also another chamber music festival and so on and so on. This I may say positive. It should be more used. Maybe it's helpful that there is no European Union responsibility in this because it's moving by itself. That might sound like a cynical comment. It's not cynical. I think if the things are developing out of itself, I think they are more sustainable than if it is forced on this. So far, I think we need a public discussion, and I think you can contribute in your different capacities. What can we Europeans do in favor of the other parts of the world? That's quite necessary. This discussion is not too much existing. I think we are in a certain way self-concerned. We are looking to ourselves. This discussion about neo-nationalism, I think it's not neo-nationalism. It's old egoism. We want to protect ourselves. There's a very nice Viennese sentence existing. Everybody thinking on himself or herself. Only me, I'm thinking on myself. I think this is sometimes happening for the Europeans. And we must be able, okay, it's quite right that we are thinking ourselves, but also in the context of the others. So far, the Europeans have one tendency. We are speaking about neighborhood, but the neighbor is the one who is farthest off from us, not the next neighbor. It should be on distance. I'm always saying in German, not Nächstenliebe, it's Fernstenliebe. I think if he's far off, then it is okay, we love him. But if he's a neighbor, then he shall stay out. And that might be a possibility to move the things forward.
Thank you. I was also very interested to hear from Mr. Xavier Bender about the news this morning that the US and EU trade negotiations have been cancelled and postponed, rather. However, I would like to perhaps ask you to elaborate further on the role of trade and the economic external action. In particular with the US, as we're about to negotiate the world's largest trade deal, and also perhaps bringing in a very small amount of the way in which the NSA revelations from Mr. Snowden will possibly affect our negotiations and also our relationship with the United States in the future.
I'll try to be brief. The negotiations have been cancelled. I mean, I misspoke. It's the second round of negotiations that were to be in Brussels next week due to the budget situation in the United States. Actually, if you go on the website of the White House these days, there's a big pop-up that tells you that due to the failure of Congress to agree, so it's specifically pointing out Congress failing to decide something.
And please donate.
They should do that, right? The impact of trade negotiations is very important, and let's not forget as well that that's how the EU first started. It's a political project built on an economic instrument. It's coal and steel, not more. Then it evolved, and trade policy has always been for the EU a way of growing, and at the same as an economic actor. And at the same time, it's one of the instruments it uses to project. There have been successful negotiations with countries that are considered of lesser economic power. We think of Korea, Canada, which is about to be closed as well. And it's what the EU uses to remain a global power, if I can say so. It is the biggest economic bloc in the world. the exchanges between Americans and Europeans are estimated at 2 billion euros a year. It's the biggest economic relationship. I mean, the impact concretely of a successful negotiation on growth and economics for the EU is estimated to 1% GDP. I mean, I don't want to go into these details. What matters is, are we willing, Europeans and Americans, to consider that, for instance, the standards in Germany are as good as the standards in Wyoming? Are we willing to consider that an American regulation is as good as a European regulation on milk, on pharmaceuticals? It's a question of what we value as being safe and what we consider as being a model or an instrument that actually builds our society. And that's where the debate, it goes far beyond trade. And that's where the NSA the revelations on the NSA actually came in. It's not the revelation itself that is of interest. It's the fact that the European Parliament went nuts about it. It's the fact that a number of people are reconsidering the entire relationship with the United States because of these revelations. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the European Parliament as well. And it is interesting to see how much involved it wants to be in the trade agreement and how much it wants to be involved in foreign policy issues at EU level. There is a dialogue between Congress and the European Parliament. It's very low, but it exists. And the trade negotiations are actually, and should not be seen as a trade agreement. It is called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And that word of partnership is extremely important. It's a partnership. We're partners, equal partners in a project. And it's a shift somehow in how the EU perceives itself and wants to project itself. We talked about projection. It wants to project itself as an equal partner on the economic side with the United States. We'll have to see how the round of negotiations go. I'm very concerned about the European Parliament elections in May, not just because of the push that might happen into Euroscepticism or nationalistic parties, but more about the composition of the Parliament and what would be discussed during the campaigns and how Europe will be talked about during the campaigns, because Europeans don't care about these elections and their results usually show it. But it is the first time that they might actually care a little bit more because of the crisis and because a lot of politicians will play on that. And because a lot of politicians, I fear, will also play the card of the agreement with the United States. We do not want to be like the Americans. That's what I hear every day in Brussels. And the NSA revelations gave opportunity and give more opportunity for people in Brussels and elsewhere to say, we do not want to be Americans. In the long term, is that a positive thing or a bad thing? I don't know. In the short term, it is more a negative approach to being a European.
Thank you. Mr. Buzet, would you like to?
I think I share, especially with the last point. First of all, I think concerning the elections to the European Parliament, you are quite right. There's a real danger. Even some are saying that the majority of Eurosceptical members of the Parliament. I don't believe in this direction, but the real danger is that the participation of the elections will be very low. And with the negative approach, you are getting sometimes easier for somebody to vote than with a positive approach, because everybody is saying, everybody is for this European Union, I think, but it has to be critical, and therefore I'm not going there, or I'm voting here for negative. Here something can be done by the public, and I think it's up to movements which are present here, I think, to do it in this direction. The second question concerning Americans is extremely important. I'm out of the generation where we had a very positive approach to the Americans. I think what has happened after the Second World War, if I'm considering Marshall Plan here, I think it will be quite another situation. And you can say that especially the Americans have learned something out of the history. I think if after the First World War some similar activity would have existed, I think we have avoided Hitler. That's of extreme importance, and in a certain way, I was also convinced that the Nobel Prize for the European Union was right, because the existence of the European Union and the alternative to join the European Union avoided wars after the downbreak of the Soviet Empire. That has been also considered, because the breakdown of big empires is always connected with wars. I think we had only these wars in Yugoslavia, it was not a big empire, but it was lacking the right strategy on the subject. Therefore, we had here this war. But I think, are we really, it might be, the German Marshall Fund might be also the level for, are we discussing with the Americans really what they are doing wrongly? I think I may say the security, they are fixed on the question of security extremely. It's idiotic. I think on every airport you can see what it means really, and so on and so on. They are control freaks in a way which is really horrible. Have we really a discussion, maybe, between the Europeans and the Americans on this subject? Because it does not solve the problems. I'm always asking, if you're controlled at the airports, those who are standing there, they are not able to answer my question. I'm always saying, how many have you catched in the car? What did you really find? If you are nearly naked and without shoes, and so on and so on. These are consequences of the American behavior. And here we need a kind of a partly global discussion on this subject. What does security really mean, and in which way can it be better done as it is now?
Professor Stadler, would you like to?
Yes, I can only agree to that, and the problem is, little remark again from the history, first to explain our problems which we have. Coal and steel, you mentioned, has been the basis of European integration. It's necessary not to forget. It was a war capacity reducing approach, and nothing more. Then we had the trade thing, and here comes an idea of Immanuel Kant into the context. He said, the future, he spoke about Germany, his time divided into 100 states, but it's also true for Europe. If you have a highly intense trade connection with your neighbors, you are unable to wage war any longer to each other. So this is a deep, you cannot afford to wage war. If you are stopping your trade context, you are losing so much, which you can never win with a war. So it is simply idiotic to start a war. So this is the background. And again, don't forget, the construction of the European integration was to keep peace inside Europe and to make it stable vis-à-vis the threat, the dangers of the Soviet part. Don't forget, this had been the basic construction of Europe. And now the Soviet threat faded away. We have new challenges, global competence, and the old construction is still acting. So the institutions are directing in one way, and the reality is in another one. And here is the reason for the friction. But I would say something positive. I think it's one of the last remarks from my side, and I want just to provoke with that. Couldn't it be true that our toughest instrument of European foreign policy is enlargement? You talked about the breakdown of empires. The only empire which is now growing and growing from year to year is the European Union. Try to look at this from that point of view. Where we started as a Charlemagne Remember Club and Nostalgia Club, and now we are the biggest bureaucratic unity on European soil in the whole history of our continent, including more than 500 million people without one shot, without one war. Almost everyone who joined the European Union did it free will based. And this is the miracle of historical dimension. And put it from the Russian point of view, their empire is fading away. They are expecting war, tanks, divisions, American power, and what is coming? We talked about it, European Commission. People without competences, weak people. shadow powers. And they are growing and growing and growing. You cannot stop them. This is really soft or smart. This is not only soft, this is smart power. Because everyone is happy to join the empire. Look back in the history books, who was happy to join the empire? Not even the Gallians with Caesar. No one joined happily an empire.
Trieste.
I told you, if you want to try to understand Europe, look closely to Austria, with all the good and the bad sides, and you understand European policy better. And my last remark, because I was discussing that with my students, please never try to understand the European future from 1945 on. Try to understand the European future from 1914 on. This is the key. Not from 45. This reduces the spectrum of your analysis. Go back to 1914 and try to understand the problems, and then you have an idea how our solutions could look like.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up for questions from the floor. How I'd like to do this is to take 3 questions and then perhaps ask each of our panel speakers to make some concluding remarks, bearing in mind the questions, and then we can move on nicely to some coffee and cake in the next room. So if there are 3 people who'd like to pose a question, please raise your hand and I will ask you. Yes, if you'd like to stand up, say your name, where you're from, and pose your question.
Right. Thank you very much. My name is Jan van Scotland. I'm a student here at the Academy. First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists very much for a very reality-grounded morning, because many of the EU-related talks I have attended were more based on wishful thinking than on the facts. So in that sense, it's been extremely interesting for me, and I'd like to thank you very much. Question, maybe you all sort of touched upon it, is about military capacity, because and whether or not, in a way, European countries might, as an instrument of foreign policy, in fact, also rebuild their armies, because right now we are becoming more and more Viennas, because in a way every single individual European country is slowly dismantling its army also to pay for welfare states. So I mean, I'm not saying that it will be a salvation strategy, but what do you think of that from a sort of foreign policy point of view? Because after all, military capacity, whether or not we want to use it, and I certainly think we should not glorify it at all, but to have it is always useful. Look at Syria. I mean, so what are your reflections on that? Or do you think that's not a European thing? Maybe it also says something about identity.
Thank you.
So to make it such a long question.
Another question from the floor? Yes, please.
Slatko Mikulic, Slovenian Paneuropean Union. Since we have a chap from US, I would like to use or abuse this opportunity to put this question. Like in 20th century, US came 4 times to save Europe in the wars waged for. First World War, Second World War, Cold War, and in Yugoslavia. And my feeling is at this time that US is more concentrated on this Asian Pacific theater, and how high or is still Europe a privileged part of US, or is it still on US agenda at all? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And a final question from the floor, if any? No, then I'd like to invite all of our panelists then to just to make some very brief closing remarks, bearing in mind the questions on military capacity of the European Union and its member states, and also as the second question about the US and its focus, whereas it had previously helped the European Union, Europe as in its wars, with its new focus potentially on the Asia Pacific. So Professor Stadler, perhaps you'd like to begin.
Okay, let's start with the military capacity. Well, you're absolutely right. We have here a deep problem, but also a problem of management. Europe is more investing into defense than the United States, where we're doing in 28 little units. So divide et impera done by ourselves on ourselves. So we're artificially reducing our political impact of the military spending we are doing. Let's call it like that. We are reducing the political impact of the military spending we are doing. We are giving the money, but have nothing in return for that. This is very economic. This is the first point. Second point, pooling and sharing. So I have also teaching in the Landesverteidigungsakademie, so I know it's a serious thing. For the real specialists, it's a serious thing, and it's a very intelligent thing. But from a political point of view, I would call it like old Marx, opium for the politicians. Everyone hopes that the other one will help him or her, so they are all reducing, hoping the other one will not reduce. So I'm pooling nothing, I'm sharing everything. So this is a little bit I would say the back of the politicians. So we do that, so we are reducing everything and everyone will help us. So this is a little bit problem. The US and the Pacific. This is a very complicated question. I would say the US cannot forget Europe. They cannot give up Europe. Because, and this is my interpretation of this trade partnership, as you call it, this is the indicator for them. They need the European trade partnership in order to survive the Asian challenge. I'm not so optimistic for the American stability. Economically, they have their problems. Militarily, they are in the first round, as I call it, in the third generation warfare, quite successful. In the fourth generation warfare, in the culture-based political peace building, they're not so successful. They have lots of open problems, not solved problems. This is not a good approach. So they need the Europeans more and more as partners. So what we need to do, and here I'm a little bit a Euro chauvinist, if you want. Let's not talk too much about the Americans. They are playing their game, they have their interests, they have their character, we know them, they are part of our heritage, I would like to say. But we have to do our homework. I'm always a little bit, I love the French and their approaches, but the hyperpuissance américaine is a little bit boring now. Who forces the Europeans to remain weak? This is my question. The Americans are as they are, and our job is not to cry all the time how strong the Americans are. We have to work about how weak we are, and it's not necessary that we are that weak. We are weak enough demographically, and lots of problems we have, but we are not so weak in reality as we are now performing, and this is our job to do. So don't look all the time what the Americans are dreaming, fearing, or thinking now. Let's do our job here, and then we can be partners for them, and then we can do something together.
Thank you for your questions. I'll start with the military capacity question. And you mentioned pooling and sharing. It's the biggest challenge. I think as long as member states are not willing to put their own military capacity at the service of a broader European defense mechanism, it won't happen. Now there are examples of Europeans being able to cooperate in sending troops under the EU flag. So that's a first sign, a positive sign. But other than that, as long as the French and I am French, are willing to send troops by themselves in Africa, Northern Africa, and in Mali, it's hard to imagine a European military capacity in itself. It might come, there are initiatives, and it's interesting, we haven't mentioned NATO at all today. It still exists. And it's hard to say if it will continue to exist, but I hope so. It's interesting, we actually, in the polling I mentioned, we actually asked people if they still believe NATO is essential, and the vast majority of people do think it's still essential in Europe. But then we asked the question, what is NATO for you? Is it an alliance of democracies? Is it a way for a military capacity to build up? Is it here to project Western values. And the majority of people answered that for them NATO is an alliance of democracies, which is interesting when you think about the fact that it's a military alliance. So I think that there's something in Europe that we still perceive as democracy as being our biggest weapon in terms of how we see it. I know the Americans are very much looking forward for a real European defense capacity, and Secretary Gates said it when he said his farewells. But it's still going to take some time. I mean, not that many aircraft carriers in Europe yet, or submarines or troops. So that still remains to be seen. There is a defense council at the end of the year. Hopefully some main decisions. There's a push by the French and the British and the Germans. So we'll see where that leads. On the U.S. Pivot, and I'll put it in quotation marks, to Asia. The administration was very quick in denying the fact that it's a pivot. It's a greater focus. And Europe remains the United States' main partner. I mean, I'm not American. I grew up in the United States. Sometimes feel American very much, and fortunate to work for an American organization. And we talk about this a lot, and that is our mission as well. There's a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiated. There are a number of initiatives towards Asia. It is seen that President Obama canceling his trip to Asia this week was also seen as maybe a sign, but no, it's budget issues. It's not Europe. Poor man, they stole his wallet. It's Europe still matters, and I think that the crisis actually was the trigger for Americans to remember. The fact that Timothy Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, went to Europe in the middle of the crisis, tried to attend a council meeting to tell Europeans that the economic stability of Europe matters for the political stability of the United States is something very important. And the TTIP, the Trade Investment Partnership, is also a foreign policy instrument towards other partners. It would be a catastrophe for Europeans if it failed. It would be a catastrophe for Americans if it failed, because it is a way for Europeans and Americans to project as leaders and a global power in the world. Both of them say it is not directly against the rise of China or the rise of other countries, not directly, but definitely indirectly. So that's something important to remember. You mentioned 4 times that Americans came to save Europeans. They would definitely come a 5th time. I'm absolutely sure about it. They consider Europe as part of their history too. And you say they're a part of us, and we're a part of them too. So I'm convinced of that. And to conclude, we just mentioned smart power, which is an American strategy as well. I hope Europe will continue its soft power. I just hope it doesn't fall into sweet power, because it's a risk that we're contended into our historical role of the soft ones.
Mozartkugeln, what do you want?
We should distribute them all. So I'm a bit concerned about that, but other than that, it's still very relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yu.
I think first of all, as an Austrian, to speak about military is extremely difficult because our behavior is like cowards. I'm pointing out the behavior of the Austrians concerning the Golan Heights. I think if we are not anymore prepared in the framework of the United Nations to overtake responsibilities, and if a newspaper is writing we shall withdraw, then the whole government is saying, okay, we are withdrawing. It's horrible concerning the sense for security and defense. I think that's mirroring.
It was a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just cowardness, there had been legal backgrounds. So it's not that.
Okay, legal backgrounds.
Yeah.
You can interpret everything.
No.
Legal background.
They stayed without legal basis 6 months longer than they had the right to stay there. And then the problem was that the UN couldn't move to empower the mandate. This was.
But now you have to look which states are prepared to send now troops.
Yeah, with a new mandate. little bit
Yeah, for
changed.
sure.
That's the problem.
But I think it's
So
not showing a preparedness, I think, to contribute to security.
I know people who served there in the hot sphere, and they told me the realities in Golan. So it was a tougher job than typical for Austrians. Let's say.
Yeah, okay, but if you are putting military forces there out of security, I think you have to consider that
Yeah,
it might be
but
dangerous.
it's okay.
It's not a tourist office.
It's clear, but if you are not allowed to empower the troops, which what we try to do,
Then the
Then-
Austrian government has to discuss it in the United Nations and to ask
okay,
for it.
this is diplomacy. It's not my
Yeah.
topic. I'm only knowing the military background, not the diplomacy. This is your
We are
job.
really happy to withdraw. Huh? Okay, but this is, I think, a small question in
Yeah.
general. The behavior, I think, to be eager to fight elsewhere is not quite big. Maybe it's a question of smaller states. But in this context, I have to touch NATO, and here I'm a little bit critical of the Americans. For sure, the NATO have the conviction it's their instrument. And the Europeans have no chance, I think, to have a real influence. For sure, the Secretary General is always a European, it is a politician withdrawn from the active policy, always it's a nice job for retired. But I think it might be necessary to create a real European wing of NATO with its own responsibility here, which for sure is not happening, and I'm quite sure that the US government would not be very happy about this. Because they want to keep the instrument because it has a certain kind of importance on this subject. I think we have to discuss it because there's another development. I'm missing the English word, beg your pardon, what is certain in English. I think more and more the military capacity is not only done by troops in a traditional way, but by paid entities.
Private military firms.
Military firms.
Private military firms.
Military firms. I think that's a question of democracy for me.
Yes.
This we have to be discussed for sure. It is a consequence out of the weaknesses that we have another military system, but this is quite close to the end of the Roman Empire. The older Roman Empire bought, I think here, all these German tribes and so on and so on.
Who did the Germans away?
At the end of the day, the German tribes overtook the Roman Empire. If you're considering Odoaker and all these leading figures of this time. And I think this has to be discussed. What is here the role? We don't have it. We are still very much bound to our national connections. Personally, I am convinced, okay, what the French did concerning Mali, but it might be one of the last moves. It's not anymore possible. I think the former French president was saying Libya, he sent some airplanes, but that was it.
They could never do it alone. Either Libya or Mali
Yeah,
is not it.
that's it.
Never alone.
Concerning the engagement in the Pacific of the Americans, I have a full understanding. I think you should look to the literature. You have a lot of American writers writing about China. The Protestant churches were quite strong in the past in this area. There are some connections. I would propose that the Europeans should look in another direction. I have to do a little bit with this. There are two European powers under footprints coming up with an Eurasian concept. The Russians are doing so. I think this Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenian, maybe Ukraine, yes or no. Trade union is a part, and I know that the Turkish friends are very much looking under the auspices of Central Asia, the Eurasian concept. I think we have no discussion about this in the European Union.
We have no research platform at our university on
Oh,
the law faculty, established 2 months ago.
But I think extremely it should be done. What does it mean politically?
Of course.
Because it's a kind of an answer to the Arab Spring concept. Kind. It's not covering everything. And I think we shall move in this direction because the security question in the context of Eurasia, this part here, is quite for sure a bigger one. So far.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for a very invigorating debate over the past hour and a half. And I hope that you'll be able to continue these discussions and hopefully be able to question our panelists further over coffee. And I think the next panel will begin at 11:30, but I'm sure there's plenty of time for more discussions over coffee. So please will you join me in thanking all of our panelists for their contributions today.